Hello everyone, and welcome to the online lecture portion of Introduction to Mass Communication 151. It is me, your instructor, Annie Woodle, and today we're going to go over Chapter 1, Living in a Media World. And in this chapter, we will define what communication is and how it becomes mass communication. We're also going to look at some models that explain the process of transmission of mass media messages. We're going to briefly cover the history and the evolution of the mass media, and we will define what being literate about the media means. We're also going to lightly cover the 7 truths that your textbook is based on. So let's get started. What is communication? Communication is how we socially interact at a number of levels through messages. So it's the transmission of ideas from one person or institution to another. The levels of communication in this pyramid formation show the bottom level, the widest part, is intrapersonal communication. And this type of communication has the most senders. As you move up the triangle, there are fewer and fewer senders and more audience members. In mass communication, at the top, there is usually a very small group of senders creating a message for a very large audience. An example of this would be Disney. It's one company that sends out a lot of messages to tons of people, while intrapersonal communication at the bottom is messages that each of us send to ourselves to make sense out of what we see and we hear. So all of us send intrapersonal messages, lots and lots of senders, but the audience is ourselves. It's us, one member. So that is a very small audience. So let's look at these different types of communication individually. And at the bottom of that pyramid, with the most senders and the least amount of audience members, we have intrapersonal communication, which I have illustrated off to the right with a thought bubble, because this is the communication within you. This is how we react to the world around us and how we assign meaning to the things that we see and hear. And this type of communication is constant and ever present. It's anything from smiling to reflecting on our experiences. This is self-talk that we have when we debate a decision that leads to a reaction from us. Then you move up the pyramid and we have interpersonal communication, and this is communication between two people. This can be intentional, it can be accidental. And so this is the first level of communication where there is a sender and a receiver. So this is when that self-talk or that intrapersonal communication comes out and there's somebody there to witness it. So interpersonal communication can be anything from body language to texting to shouting at another person. But there is a sender and a receiver when you get to the part of the pyramid with interpersonal communication. As we move up the pyramid, we have group communication, and this is where one person is communicating with an audience of 2 or more people. The thing about group communication is that the sender and the receiver can switch places. Like in a classroom, I can speak to you and you can speak back to me, and so we are both sending and receiving messages in a fluid way. Then at the very tippy top, we have mass communication, and this has the least amount of senders and the highest amount of receivers. So you have one source, and like in my little example that I have on there, NBC broadcasting a message into many homes. That's mass communication. In this type of communication, the receivers historically are not able to have much feedback. You cannot yell at your television and NBC hears you. So it's kind of a one-way street. This model of mass communication being this one-way street is changing a lot with the internet, and messages are being democratized, the audience is able to have a voice, and everyone can send and receive information. But historically, the mass communication model, the top of the pyramid, few senders, many viewers with little voices. Let's just look a little bit deeper at what mass communication is. It's traditionally defined as a message sent by an individual or an institution to a large mixed audience, a heterogeneous audience. And this audience is usually unknown to the sender. There are few senders, many receivers. We're going to go through a fairly old model that describes mass communication called the SMCR model, or the Sender Message Channel Receiver model. And it's a good way to help us figure out who does what in the process of disseminating and consuming mass messages. The SMCR model is also known as the transmission model. It's an oversimplified description of the mass media process, but because it is so simple, it's a really good place to start understanding all the players in the process. And the problem with this transmission model is that it describes communication, mass communication, as a one-way street, and it doesn't really account for all the complex interactions that actually take place in the process, and how the players can constantly change roles, mix around, and flow back and forth. So let's look at the first player in this process, the sender. This was historically made up of many people acting in the name of one large bureaucratic organization, like a corporation or an institution. But with the internet and things like blogging, the position of sender has started to become more democratic, and individuals now have the power to create a mass message, and the audience can now send messages back to the sender. But this is source position 1 in the mass communication process. The sender is the transmitter of the message that is carried out to the masses. The next position in this process is the message itself, and that's the content being transmitted by the sender to the receiver. In order for the sender to send a message, a mass communication message, it has to go through a process of encoding. Encoding has to take place where the sender turns their idea into the message, and then the message is prepared for transmission. So in the book they give an example of like a script being drafted for television. It must be prepared through production of the message, and getting it ready for its channel of transmission. So it's written and filmed and recorded and edited, and then it's broadcast or uploaded to the proper channel. And the channel is the medium that is used to transmit the message. It takes the encoded message and places it wherever it's encoded for. So if it's created for a book, it goes in a book, and if it's created for the internet, it goes on the internet. And the channel that a message is transmitted through can have an effect on the meaning of that message. We take in something that we hear very differently than something that we see. So how a message is transmitted needs to suit its needs in order for it to be communicated effectively. For example, a pantomime will not be very effective if it's transmitted on the radio, because you need to see a pantomime person pantomiming in order to understand what they're doing. You can't hear it, and so radio would not be an effective channel for a pantomime. So the channel is just the technological tool that is used to broadcast. So anything from a book to a computer, the channel is just the way the receiver gets the message. The receiver is the audience, and it is their job to take that encoded message through a channel and decode it through a translation process. So the receiver takes in a message through a channel, they decipher it or translate it through their own lens, and try to make sense out of it. And the audience for a mass communication message is heterogeneous, which means that they differ in age, sex, religion, education, income, and a plethora of other characteristics. They are not all the same. A couple of things can disrupt the process of communication. Noise is anything that pulls your attention away from a message, and this can be anything from your child screaming in the back seat of the car when you're trying to listen to a radio program to an obstructed view of a sign or at a concert. It can be that the message is given in a language that you don't speak or through terminology that you're not familiar with. So noise is anything that obstructs your ability to take in and understand the message that is being transmitted. Feedback is considered an interference in the mass media process because historically there was little feedback, and now today audience feedback can control the messenger, like text voting for things on reality television or voicing opinions and concerns through avenues like Facebook or blogging. And feedback turns that one-way street model of communication into a two-way communication, and that causes interference in the message. It is important that we look at the models of communication to give us an understanding of the components and elements that make it up. We already looked at the transmission model, or the SMCR, which is the basis for identifying the players in the process: sender, message, channel, receiver. These are the basic building blocks for mass communication, and the other models are based on these fundamental pieces. But the other models take into account the more complex process itself. So this first one, let's look at the ritual model. The ritual model switches things around a little bit. Instead of the sender being at the center of the communication model, the receivers are at the center, or the consumers. So the ritual model focuses on the how and the why that we consume messages from the mass media. It addresses the interactivity and the ritualistic effect of the media that audience members engage in. So we, the audience, we come together and we share an experience in order to interact and relate to each other. In your book, they cite American Idol and Michael Jackson's funeral as prime examples of the ritual model. It's the why. Why do we watch these things? And the reason that we watch them is so that we can talk about them with our community around us and have a shared experience and interact and bring us together as people. So we want to wake up tomorrow and go to work and talk with our friend about what happened on American Idol last night because it helps us relate to them. The publicity model looks at how the media can shed light on a topic. And this is just the action of showing an idea to the public can be the thing that makes it important. So just covering a topic in the mass media makes it important no matter what is said about it. It doesn't have to be good or bad, just the fact that it is in the mass media and all of us in this huge audience are viewing it is the thing that makes it important. The reception model looks at the audience again and tries to identify how members of the audience glean information and create meaning out of mass media messages, how they decode them. So this reception model sees the content of mass media messages as being fluid and based on the lens that it's decoded through. And each lens through which a message is viewed changes the meaning, because we all have a different lens based on who we are, and the feelings and beliefs and experiences that we've had all change how we will each understand a single message. So the message is not fixed or permanent in the reception model. Go ahead and check out figure 1.1 on page 20 in your textbook, and it just shows the different orientations of the sender and receiver in each of these models. And each model just kind of looks at a different aspect of the role of the sender and the receiver. So just go ahead and look at that in your book so it can help you understand each of these better. So we are going to go quickly through the evolution of the media world and try to understand how we got to the amazing technological advances we have now in mass media. Mass communication has been evolving for a very, very long time. Before we could communicate in such a broad way, we mainly communicated face to face. So intrapersonal communication within ourselves transmitted out to those around us, which was usually very small groups, villages or towns, until the 1400s. Communication began expanding through the Catholic Church in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. The Vatican would start disseminating a message, and it was carried through a communication network. And the network was built of cardinals and bishops and priests who took them to cathedrals and towns and villages throughout Europe. The messages were shared with groups, which was just group communication, but as they rippled out to other places, it transitioned from group communication into a form of mass communication. And it's just the basic mass communication model. There was one source of information, which was the church, and it was transmitted out to a broad and heterogeneous audience over a very wide area. Then, in the 1450s, the first real revolution in mass communication took place through the invention of movable type. Movable type allowed mass production of printed materials to become a reality, and people were able to transmit messages to an even broader audience, and it became easier and cheaper with this invention of the printing press. And the spreading of information led to very radical and powerful social changes through flyers and pamphlets and books and maps that were being produced at the time. And then this increase in printed materials also led to a rise in literacy rates. More people began to read, more ideas began to spread, and it changed the world. But this spread of information was relatively slow, especially compared to now, until the introduction of the steam-powered printing press in 1814. When the steam-powered printing press came about, printed materials could be made faster and easier and cheaper than ever before, and ideas began to spread like wildfire. And if you look at the history of mass communication, it's pretty amazing to think about how slowly this process came about from the 1450s to the 1800s, and how radically it's changed from the 1800s until now. Then in 1844, the first telegraph line opened up from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and this was the first time that long-distance, instantaneous electronic communication was available. Before this time, you had to print a message and physically carry it the distance that it had to go. And then, by 1866, telegraph cables had been laid all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and they spanned from the United States to Europe, and this changed the speed of a message radically between these two countries. Before this time, it took 2 weeks to deliver a message each way, so 2 weeks there and 2 weeks back, a month, and now people could do it in a matter of minutes. Then, in the 1880s, the gramophone, or the phonograph, was invented, and this allowed audio to be recorded and played back. This invention allowed music to be mass produced for the first time and listened to outside of live performances. Then in the late 1800s, the development of radio made it possible for the first time that a live message could be broadcast to a large, broad audience, and the reach just was becoming broader and broader than ever before, and the cost to disseminate that message was low and live. So more and more people began purchasing radios, the audience grew, the content was developed, and we had radio, which was a very important part of people's homes. Then, in the late 1800s, the development of motion pictures came about, and films were shared at Nickelodeon theaters, which spread worldwide, and this began the homogenization of culture in dress and image. So a kid in Middle America would possibly be wearing the same clothing style as somebody in Europe. So radio and movies were the revolution in mass media, which transformed it into a very profitable business. And major corporations began producing entertainment for money, and that money mainly came from advertisers that would advertise during their broadcasts. Television came about after movies. In 1939, the first television broadcast went over the airwaves, and it was Franklin D. Roosevelt opening the New York's World Fair on live television. And that entertainment model that was used in radio and was so successful was transplanted into television and made into a visual format. So in the beginning, very few people had television sets, but as the content grew, and people started purchasing televisions, it was kind of symbiotic. There was more content, there was more audience, there was more content, there was more audience, and the masses flocked to the box, and we have never been the same. The internet, which is the latest revolution in mass communication, is a channel that has converged every type of media that we've just talked about into one source and allowed the audience to participate like never before. So throughout this class, it will come up a lot, and I find myself saying, and then there was the internet, because all of these types of media have been funneled into this one source. So the internet has drastically changed the media landscape that we live in by democratizing the message and changing the players into constantly fluid components in the mass communication process. Senders are receivers, receivers are senders, and everyone is a creator. So we have looked at what mass communication is, the models that explain its pieces and parts, and a brief history of how it evolved. So now we're going to look at how to read it. And media literacy is the receiver's understanding of a transmitted message. And having a high degree of media literacy means that we understand how the media operates. It means that we understand the messages delivered by the media. It means that we understand the role that the mass media plays in society, and that we understand how to respond to the messages and transmissions that we receive. There are a lot of different dimensions to understanding the media and being truly literate of its process. And these dimensions are cognitive, emotional, aesthetic, and moral. And they come into play when we decode images and sounds that are sent to us. So let's take a look at these four basic dimensions of media literacy. The cognitive dimension refers to our ability to decipher a message intellectually. What we know can greatly impact our ability to decipher a message. So if we have a limited vocabulary in medical terminology, we might interpret a message very differently than a person who has a broad vocabulary in the same subject. The cognitive dimension is based on our learned skills and how those skills help us process the information that we take in from the media we receive. The emotional dimension is the feelings that are created by the message. Does it make the viewer angry or happy or sad? These emotions that we feel when we see a message play a role in forming the lens and the filter that we decode the message in. So if you watch, let's take for instance the presidential campaign, and you know that you hate a certain candidate, you're going to listen to what he says very differently than you will listen to what the candidate you like says. So your different emotions attached to the message you're receiving will change your idea of what that message means. The aesthetic dimension involves the artistic value of a piece of media. This is the audience understanding of a message beyond its surface. So you understand the skills required to make that piece of media or how it compares to similar works, and you look at it understanding or not if it has artistic value that resonates with the human experience. Does it have artistic value? That's the aesthetic dimension. The moral dimension is the values of the message. So Pepsi probably has a little bit different moral values than, say, Big Brothers Big Sisters organization. And understanding the moral values of the sender can greatly increase your understanding of the message. If a group like Big Brothers Big Sisters is sending a message, you probably think that it's to gain support for their organization and help children, because that is what they have, said that their moral belief is. If Pepsi sends us a message, we understand that they are trying to get us to buy their product and want to make money. So looking critically at the media and just really understanding all these different filters or these dimensions exist are just tools that can help make us literate of the messages that we receive through the mass media. And mass media is one of the most prevalent ways that we receive information in the world today outside of our families and our communities. So I think it is very important that we understand the who and the what and the why of this process, because it helps us navigate this intensely saturated media world that we live in a skillful and critical way, instead of being a passive consumer of messages. You need to question the messages you receive and understand the motives behind them being sent. Hansen, the author of your textbook, has kind of outlined this entire text on the 7 truths they don't want you to know about the media. And they're just 7 key issues of media literacy. And they're discussion topics that are often not talked about when we look at the media, because they're pretty complex. So he refers to these as the 7 truths. Hansen's truth 1 is that the media are essential components of our lives because we depend on the media, from everything from weather reports to meanings placed on symbols like logos or signs. We depend on the media for information about the world around us, and then in return the media depends on us for revenue to exist. They have to survive through audience members. So it's a symbiotic relationship. We use them to get information about the world, and they use us for revenue. Truth 2. There are no mainstream media. So this is often who we refer to as them, but media is media. And one is not mainstream and the other non-mainstream. So one type of media may just have a broader reach, but because one source has a smaller audience, it does not make them less significant than a huge corporate conglomerate's message in the scheme of mass media. So, I'm I'm on the fence about Truth 2. I think that the mainstream media is what we get every day, and the non-mainstream media is doing work on the fringes to shed light on different topics. But this is Truth 2 that Hansen has put forward and based this book on. Truth 3, everything from the margin moves to the center. So media content that's on the fringe or the margins of society gets interwoven into the mass media fabric of society. And it's just a natural movement of ideas and people and words and phrases and slang terms into society as a whole. So terminology and fashion fads and political movements, all of these things come out of society and move into the mainstream limelight. I think a good example of this is when you think about the fad of wearing trucker hats. That was something that very few people in society did unless you were a trucker or old man, and then it moved into the mainstream, into the center, into the limelight where people on television were wearing them because it came out of society. Truth 4, nothing's new. Everything that happened will happen again. And this is just that phrase, history repeats itself. And in mass media, every technological innovation has produced problems. And the problems are similar, but they just take on different forms based on the technology of that time. Radio was afraid of television. Films were afraid of television. Television's afraid of the internet, which leads us to Truth 5. New media are always scary. So this is known as the legacy fear, and basically change is scary, and concerns about media, everything from the internet giving away free content or free access to music, to mind control and manipulation. The common concerns about media include control, manipulation, the strengthening of power for the few, that it replaces healthier or other activities that we could be doing with our time, that it's a waste of time, and that it just basically detracts from productive things we could be doing as a society. Truth 6, activism and analysis are not the same thing. So this is what this is like critics of the media talk about an analysis of the media to the public. Like, say, a senator says that television violence is detrimental to our children. And he didn't actually analyze the media and make these findings and study it and figure out what it was doing to our children, but he might be pushing an agenda for a group of voters instead of truly critically analyzing the media and its effects on our children. So the agenda of a person can have something to do with what they are trying to be activists for, and so they'll put up this analysis of the media when they truly don't know that much about it, and they just want to become the face of an activist that is tied to that certain topic. Truth 7, there is no they. So there's no boogeyman, and the boogeyman is no one, and it's all of us, and there's no one to blame in particular. We use the overgeneralizing them or they to identify a group of evildoers or people that are harming society, and it's them or they, but they are not one unified sneaky group having meetings in a dark laboratory underground and creating these things that hurt society. The media is created by many, many people and many, many groups, and they don't have a unified them. So here are your questions for class. I want you to answer these and bring these to class with you. They will help you build your study guide for the midterm. Question 1, What are the levels of communication used in social networking sites like Facebook and MySpace? And I want you to really look in and analyze the levels of communication and then analyze the ways that we communicate in social networking. Number 2, write a short definition of each of the models of communication that we discussed: the transmission model, the ritual model, publicity model, and the reception model. And then what is the role of the sender and receiver in each of these models? Question 3, what are the 4 basic dimensions of media literacy? What are the lenses that we look at the media through? So I hope you enjoyed the lecture today. Bring your questions with you to class and we will discuss and answer the lecture questions. Have a wonderful day.